Have you ever prayed with all your heart and yet felt that wasn't God listening? Have you ever wondered why, even though you are faithful, your prayers seem not leaving the ceiling? The truth is that millions of Christians are praying the wrong way, and they don't even know it. And the most shocking thing, Jesus left very clear what is the only right way to pray, but 90% of people just ignore it. In this video, you will discover the forgotten teaching of Jesus, a model of prayer that is not empty repetition, but a real, living, transforming connection with God. And when you put this into practice, you can try answers you never imagined, peace that passes understanding, and a spiritual life that truly flourishes. But be careful. This truth has been buried by centuries of tradition and religiosity, and now you are about to unearth it. So if you really want to understand why your prayers don't seem to work and discover the path Jesus taught, watch until the end. Now tell me here in the comments, are you ready to abandon automatic prayer and live a real faith? Comment below, I will pray as Jesus taught. And tell me where you're watching from, because I want to know how far this message is reaching thirsty hearts like yours. If you write, we will like your comment as a sign that we are together on this spiritual journey. And of course, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any content like this, because this is just the beginning. How many times have you knelt down to pray and, when you finished, felt as if nothing had happened? As if you were just talking to the wind, pouring words into the void? For many Christians, this is a constant feeling, a disconcerting silence that generates doubts, frustration, and, in some cases, even a departure from the faith. And the hardest part is that most of the time, no one talks openly about it. People keep praying, but deep down they carry the feeling that something is wrong. What if I told you that this frustration has an explanation? That perhaps the problem is not your faith, nor your sincerity, but rather the way you have learned or unlearned to pray. The truth is that many of us were taught to pray as a custom, a religious obligation, a duty that needs to be fulfilled. We repeat ready-made phrases, we use formulas learned since childhood, believing that this is enough to connect us with God. But prayer has never been about the number of words or about following a memorized pattern. It has always been about relationship, about presence, about truth. And when prayer becomes an empty ritual, we lose what is most powerful about it, the encounter. Many people still believe that all they have to do is bend their knees and say anything for the heavens to open. But the Bible shows that this is not the case. In Isaiah 29:13, God says, "These people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me." This is a direct warning. It's not about what comes out of your mouth, it's about where your heart is. And when our hearts are far from me, even the most beautiful prayers lose their power. There is a profound difference between praying with words and praying with the heart. Praying with words is easy, anyone can do it. But praying with the heart requires surrender, it requires exposure, it requires truth, and that is uncomfortable, because it means admitting our faults, our fears, our deepest desires before an all-seeing God. It is much easier to maintain a semblance of faith than to bare ourselves emotionally before God. Perhaps this is why many avoid truly praying, because true prayer confronts us. It forces us to stop, to look within, to realize how wounded, tired, and overwhelmed we are. And at the same time, this is exactly what God wants. He is not looking for perfection. He is looking for closeness. He does not want well-crafted speeches. He wants sincerity. And that is when everything changes. When we understand that prayer is not a religious obligation, but a bridge between heaven and our hearts, something begins to change. We realize that prayer is not about convincing God to do what we want. It's about aligning ourselves with what He already wants to do in us. It's about intimacy, a real dialogue, a space where we can be who we are, without masks, without filters. Now think, when was the last time you prayed truthfully? Not just with words, but with your heart wide open. When was the last time you cried before God without shame, without fear, without trying to impress? Maybe you are feeling tired without the strength to continue praying. Maybe you think God is not listening to you. But let me tell you something, God is not deaf. He just does not respond to acts. He responds to sincerity. And if you are going through this moment of silence, of doubts, of a feeling of emptiness, know that you are not alone. Many have gone through this. Even the great characters of the Bible faced this silence. David in his Psalms often cries out, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever?" This shows that even those who had a heart according to God's face these moments. But he did not stop praying, because he knew that even when heaven seems closed, God is still listening. The prayer that God hears is the one that comes from a broken heart. A heart that acknowledges its smallness, that doesn't try to control the situation, that surrenders. And it's that kind of prayer that changes everything. Not necessarily our external circumstances, but our perspective, our inner strength, our hope. That is why, before continuing, you need to understand this deeply. If your prayer is being done only out of habit, obligation, or fear, perhaps it is time to stop, breathe, and start over. Start over with intention, with awareness, with presence. God no longer wants an automatic repetition. He wants your heart. And here is the invitation. How about starting today, transforming your prayer into a true encounter? Instead of reciting ready-made phrases, how about talking to God as if you were talking to a father who knows you better than you know yourself, a father who cares, a father who wants to listen to you, yes, but also wants to transform you in the process. This is the starting point. This is where the journey begins, because before we can learn the right way to pray, we need to recognize the wrong patterns we've been taught. We need to empty ourselves of what is mechanical and fill ourselves with what is alive. And only then will we be ready to hear what Jesus taught about how to pray, not just lip service, but from a deeper place. Have you ever noticed how many people treat prayer like a performance? They use fancy words, rehearsed intonations, memorized quotes. They close their eyes, raise their hands, adopt a reverent posture, but inside, they are empty. Not because they are fake or malicious, but because somewhere along the way, they learned that prayer is repeating what they heard from others. It is doing what everyone else does. And over time, prayer has become a spectacle, not a conversation. Jesus knew this would happen. He knew that the human heart tends to transform the sacred into a system, the intimate into a habit, the relationship into a ritual. That's why he not only taught us how to pray, he also warned us about how to pray, no pray. And these warnings are just as important as the positive teachings, because they reveal the dangers that can distance us from God even when we think we are getting closer. In Matthew 6, Jesus speaks with disconcerting clarity. When you pray, do not be like the hypocrites. They love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward. What Jesus is saying here is not that praying in public is wrong, but that the intention behind prayer is what defines its value. And sadly, too often that intention is tainted by ego, vanity, and the desire for human approval. How many times have we caught ourselves trying to appear spiritual in front of others? How many times have we measured the depth of our faith by the eloquence of our words? Prayer has become a kind of spiritual performance, where we want to be recognized as people of prayer, when in reality we are hungry for intimacy with God, but we are afraid of appearing weak, broken, and flawed. So we hide this vulnerability behind well-constructed words. And it is exactly this kind of prayer that Jesus condemns. Then he says something even more powerful. And when you pray, do not keep on babbling like pagans, for they think they will be heard for their many words. This completely debunks the idea that repeating words automatically brings spiritual power. Jesus is showing us that the value of prayer is not in the number of words or the sophistication of the vocabulary. It is in the intention, the connection, the delivery. This is where many people go wrong, without even realizing it. They think that praying is about repeating formulas, familiar phrases, and memorized passages. And yes, there is beauty in reciting verses or traditional prayers when it comes from the heart. But when it becomes an automatic routine, we lose its purpose. Prayer stops being a living channel of relationship with God and becomes a mechanical, cold expression, devoid of truth. God doesn't want to hear the prayer that others have taught you to pray. He wants to hear yours, with your words, with your voice, with your soul. He wants the prayer of your bad day, of your tiredness, of your fear. He wants the prayer of, Father, I don't know what else to say. Because that, yes, is a true prayer. A prayer that comes from the Spirit and not just from the mouth. Perhaps you grew up hearing that there is a right way to pray. That you should start by giving thanks, then ask for forgiveness, then intercede for others, and only then present your requests. And yes, these structures can be helpful. They can bring order to your prayer. But they are no substitute for sincerity. The problem is not in the form, but in the motivation. If your prayer follows a pattern, but your heart is present, God hears it. But if you follow the pattern just out of habit, without truly connecting, maybe that is why you feel this emptiness. The most curious thing is that Jesus not only criticized the wrong models of prayer, he lived, in practice, the intimate and true prayer. He prayed in silence. He prayed in tears. He prayed with simple words, but with total surrender. In Gethsemane, for example, Jesus prayed so intensely that he sweated blood, and his words were few, direct, real. Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done. This is not a formula. This is relationship. And that is why we need to deconstruct what we have been taught about prayer as a religious obligation. We need to relearn how to pray, not as someone who recites a memorized text, but as children who converse with the Father. Prayer is not a magic password to unlock blessings. It is a deep dive into the heart of God, and only those who are willing to take off their masks can dive in. If you have been praying the same way for years and are not seeing any fruit, perhaps it is time to review what is behind these prayers. Do they come from your soul, or do they come from your tradition? Are you praying because you are hungry for God, or because you feel you have to pray? These are difficult but necessary questions, because only when we recognize our deviations are we able to return to the essence. And the essence of prayer is not religiosity, it is relationship. Jesus did not come to give us a religion, he came to show us a path to reconnect with the Father. And prayer is the main road on this journey, but this road is only effective when we walk it with truth, humility, and faith. So before we go any further, do a quick examination of your conscience. How have you been praying? Have you been praying from your heart or just with your lips? Have you been seeking God's presence or people's approval? Have you been speaking with faith or repeating empty words? These questions are not meant to accuse you, they are meant to set you free. Because when you identify your error, you move closer to healing. And believe me, what Jesus will reveal in the next few steps has the power to transform not only your prayer life, but your entire life. Now that we understand what Jesus taught us to avoid in prayer, the empty repetitions, the appearance seeking, the lack of connection, we're ready to take an even deeper step. Because he not only warned us about the deviations, he also gave us a clear, objective, and powerful model, the right way to pray. And amazingly, this model has been before us for centuries, but for some reason, most people ignore its true meaning. When the disciples asked Jesus, "Lord, teach us to pray," he did not give them a complicated theory or ask for long rituals. He responded with simple but deeply spiritual words. Pray then like this, Our Father in heaven, and then follows what we know today as the Lord's Prayer. But here's the key point. Jesus now is telling us to just repeat these words as a mantra. He was revealing to us a spiritual structure model to connect with the Father in an intimate, true, and complete way. Each line of this prayer carries an essential principle of the prayer life, and if you understand what is really behind each phrase, your way of praying and living will never be the same. It all starts with, "Our Father, who art in heaven." Here, Jesus breaks a paradigm. He invites us to call God Father, not a judge, not a distant king, but Father. This changes everything. Father is relationship. It is closeness. It is acceptance. Jesus is saying, before asking for anything, recognize who it is you are talking to. It's not just anyone, it's your Father. And by saying our, he also reminds us that we are not alone. We are part of a family. This eliminates selfishness and awakens in us a sense of unity. Then he says, "Hallowed be thy name." This is reverence. It is putting God in the right place, above everything, above ourselves, above our desires. Before we make requests, before we talk about our problems, Jesus teaches us to recognize God's holiness. Prayer begins with adoration, with recognition of his majesty and purity. This is not flattery, it is alignment. Because when you contemplate who God is, your faith is strengthened and your heart is calmed. Then comes, "Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." Here is one of the most challenging and transformative parts. Jesus teaches us to pray with a desire for the kingdom of God to manifest in our lives, and that means that God's will prevail over ours. It is a real surrender. It is saying, "God, don't do what I want if it takes me away from what you want." And this prayer, when prayed sincerely, has tremendous power because it breaks our pride and puts us in a place of humility. It is letting go of wanting to control everything and learning to trust. Soon after, Jesus teaches us to ask, "Give us this day our daily bread." Here we see the practical dimension of prayer. Jesus shows us that it is indeed legitimate to present our needs to God. He wants to take care of us. But notice that he did not say, "Give us for the month" or "for the year." He teaches us to ask for what we need to today. This invites us to daily dependence, to live one day at a time, trusting that the Father will take care of tomorrow as he took care of today. The next part deals with something fundamental. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Jesus' prayer includes reconciliation because praying is also confronting our humanity. Here, we are invited to recognize that we have failed, that we need forgiveness. But we are also called to release forgiveness. Jesus makes it clear you cannot receive what you are not willing to give. The prayer that pleases God is one that comes from a repentant heart, and that at the same time becomes a channel of mercy. He continues with, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." Here we are asking for spiritual guidance and protection. Jesus recognizes that walking with God involves dangers, weaknesses, and invisible battles. And he teaches us to pray for strength to endure, wisdom to choose, and grace to remain steadfast. It is a prayer of humility, recognizing our vulnerability and asking for help. And finally, the prayer ends with, "For yours is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever." This is total surrender. It is recognizing that everything belongs to God. That in the end, our prayer is not about putting ourselves at the center, but about glorifying the one who is on the throne. Jesus ends as he began, with worship. Notice how this prayer model touches every area of our lives: identity, worship, submission, provision, forgiveness, protection, and surrender. It is a complete, balanced, and profound path, and yet it is so neglected. Many repeat these words without thinking, as if they were a spell. But Jesus never intended this. He wanted to show us the heart of true prayer. Maybe you're now realizing that you already know this prayer, but you've never really lived it. Maybe you've recited the Lord's Prayer countless times, but without really delving into what it really means. and that's okay. Because the most important thing is not what happened, but what you do from now on. And now you know, the prayer that Jesus taught is not a text to be memorized. It's a lifestyle, a way of relating to God that goes far beyond words. In the next step, we will understand how this prayer is transformed in practice into a living and transforming relationship with the Father. Because from the moment it stops being theory and becomes experience, you begin to discover what it really means to live in communion with God every day. You may know the Lord's Prayer by heart. You may even understand every principle embedded in the words that Jesus taught us. But none of this will have any real value if it doesn't come out of the paper and enter your heart. Because true prayer is not just what we understand, it is what we live. And living this prayer is much more than repeating a holy formula. It is building a real relationship with the Father day after day, word after word, silence after silence. This is where everything starts to change. When prayer stops being a theory, stops being a task, and becomes a relationship. A continuous, intimate, transformative relationship. A daily encounter where you don't just go to say what you need to, but to listen, to rest, to simply be with God. Jesus himself did this. Even though he was the Son of God, he withdrew to pray, to connect, to be alone with the Father. And he didn't do it as a mechanical ritual. He did it as someone who couldn't live without this time. Unfortunately, many Christians still view prayer as an obligation, something to be crossed off their daily to-do list. They pray in a hurry, with their minds elsewhere. And then they wonder why they don't feel God's presence. But the truth is that you can't live a deep faith with superficial prayer. God isn't looking for pretty words. He's looking for true presence. He wants to hear you, your voice, your story. He wants to be with you, not only in your pain, but also in the little routines of your day. And you may be asking yourself, but how do I turn my prayer into a relationship? The answer is simple, but it requires commitment. Start by being intentional. Set aside real time to spend with God, not spare time, but chosen time. Don't wait to feel like it. Make it a habit. As with any relationship, it's the daily investment that creates intimacy. You don't build a deep friendship by talking to someone once a week. It's the same with God. The more time you spend with him, the more familiar his voice becomes, the more real his presence becomes. The second thing is, speak sincerely. Don't try to impress. God isn't waiting for you to use pretty words. He's waiting for you to use your heart. Speak to him as you would speak to a father who loves and understands you. Tell him what you feel. Confess what you fear. Be thankful for what you have received. Open your heart without filters. The more you open yourself, the more you will realize that God is listening and that he responds, sometimes with words, sometimes with peace, sometimes with silence, but a silence that heals, that transforms, that strengthens. Another fundamental point is learning to listen. Prayer is not a monologue, it's a dialogue, and often we are so focused on talking that we forget to listen. We finished praying and moved on to the next activity. But if we want intimacy, we need to create space for the Holy Spirit to respond to us. This can happen during prayer, through a verse, a thought, a memory, a conviction in the heart. God speaks in many ways, but he only listens to those who are willing to listen. And finally, take prayer beyond your bedroom. Turn your life into prayer. Pray in the car. Pray while you cook. Pray while you walk. Pray mentally in the middle of work. This does not mean living alienated from reality, but rather connecting with heaven while walking the earth. Paul wrote to the Thessalonians, "Pray without ceasing." This is not an impossible imposition. It is an invitation to live in constant communion with God, even in the midst of daily activities. When you start living this way, something extraordinary happens. You stop seeking only answers and start seeking presence. You understand that the greatest gift of prayer is not having your requests answered, but being in the presence of the Father. This changes everything. You no longer pray out of fear, guilt, or obligation. You pray out of love, because you miss it, because you know that time is sacred, because you recognize that you cannot go through the day without this spiritual nourishment. And it's not about perfection. There will be days when you don't know what to say, days when your mind is tired, when your heart is heavy. On those days, your prayer may be a sigh, it may be a cry, it may be silence, and that's okay, because God understands every tear. God understands every silence. God even understands when you say, "Father, today I can only be here." And sometimes that's more than enough, because prayer is not measured by the quantity of words, but by the quality of presence. It is in this place of intimacy that faith deepens, that anxiety loses strength, that fear dissolves, that identity is restored. Because in the presence of God, we are reminded of who we are and who He is. And from that remembrance, we find the strength to face any day, any battle, any challenge. What Jesus taught us with the Lord's Prayer was not a text to memorize, but a path to follow, a path of reconnection. And now that you know how to transform this model into a living relationship, you are ready to see how God can use prayer to heal stories, restore lives, and transform destinies, including yours. So far, we have talked about what Jesus taught, about structure, heart, presence. But perhaps you are still thinking, this is all beautiful, but does it really work in practice? Is it possible to change my prayer life and see something concrete happen? And that is why I now want to tell you a story, a realistic story, inspired by so many testimonies that reach us. It is not a story about instant miracles or spectacular changes overnight. It is about transformation in silence, healing in constancy, and faith built amidst the rubble. It is the story of Samuel. Samuel grew up in a Christian home. From an early age, he learned to pray before going to bed, to attend church services, and to repeat verses. But as the years went by, what seemed like faith became an empty habit. As a teenager, prayer became an automatic habit. He would talk to God, but he heard nothing in return. Little by little, he began to think that it was all in his head, that maybe God wasn't even listening. Life went on, days became routine, and faith became a distant past. Over time, the wrong choices came, the wrong friendships, the impulsive decisions. Samuel fell into addiction, first as an escape, then as a routine. And before he knew it, he was already trapped in behaviors that were destroying him from the inside. He tried to quit, he tried to change, but he always went back. And in the worst moments, he still tried to pray. But the prayers were short, cold, and soon followed by guilt. God, help me. God, get me out of this. God, why don't you do anything? And the silence continued. It wasn't until Samuel lost everything, his job, his relationship, his emotional health, that something inside him began to truly break. That night, he knelt down, but he didn't say anything. He just cried. For the first time in a long time, he didn't try to appear strong. He didn't search for pretty words. He didn't try to justify his mistakes. He just cried. Face down on the floor, he said, "Father, I have nothing more to say. Just listen to me. I'm tired." That prayer had no structure. It had no beginning, middle, or end. But it was the most sincere prayer he had ever prayed in his life, and that was the beginning of something new. The next day, Samuel prayed again, still broken, still without strength, but with a willing heart. And for the first time, he began to feel peace. Not an immediate peace, but a sense that God was indeed listening, that he had never stopped listening. He was just waiting for a surrendered heart, not a well-crafted speech. In the following weeks, Samuel began to apply what he had forgotten, the Lord's Prayer, not as a formula, but as a foundation. He began by recognizing God as Father, remembering that he was still a son, even after everything. He asked for God's will to be done, even when it meant facing consequences. I asked for my daily bread, for today's strength, not for answers for the whole month. He started forgiving people he didn't even know he still hated. He began to forgive himself. And little by little, prayer became life, and life a new prayer. This process was not quick, nor was it magical. There were relapses. There were doubts. But the difference is that now Samuel no longer ran away from God on difficult days. He ran to him. And even when he sinned, he did not hide it. He went to God with a broken soul, asking for help, asking for transformation. And day after day, his faith was restored. The addiction lost its strength. His identity was rescued. And prayer became the place where Samuel found himself again and found God again. Samuel's story reminds us that prayer has the power to rebuild what life has tried to destroy, that you don't have to be well to pray right. You have to be true. God doesn't wait for you to be clean to talk to him. He wants to talk to you exactly as you are, because that's when he starts to cleanse you. This reminds me of Hannah, the mother of the biblical Samuel. The Bible tells us that in deep distress, she prayed and wept before the Lord. And the priest, upon seeing her, thought she was drunk. But she replied, "I am not drunk. I am just pouring out my soul before the Lord." And that expression, pouring out one's soul, is one of the most beautiful definitions of prayer. It is not hiding. It is not filtering. It is pouring out. With everything that is inside. Maybe you, like Samuel, are at a point where you have tried everything. You have prayed in many ways. You have repeated words. You have walked away. You have come back. And now all that is left is tiredness. If so, listen carefully. God is not tired of you. He has not given up on listening to you. He is just waiting for you to truly speak to him, for you to pour out your soul like Hannah, for you to kneel without a script, without a plan, without masks, just you and him. And when that happens, when your prayer is more sigh than speech, more surrender than demand, more heart than mouth, that's when heaven moves. Not because your words are powerful, but because God always responds to the truth. Always. Next, we will talk about an aspect that many do not understand: God's silence. Because even when we pray with the right heart, there are times when everything remains silent. And knowing how to deal with this silence is one of the most important keys to spiritual life. If this message touched you in any way, and you are ready to abandon empty prayers and live a real relationship with God, comment below, "I will pray with truth." We, on the channel, will leave a like on your comment as a sign that we are with you on this journey. And yes, we will follow your spiritual growth from now on. Now take a deep breath, because what comes next might be exactly what you needed to hear to understand why is God still silent, and how this silence may be preparing something bigger than you ever imagined. Don't leave the video. The next minute could change everything. There is a time in the journey of faith that few people talk about, but almost everyone experiences: God's silence. That time when you are praying sincerely, striving to live what you have learned, seeking with all your heart, and yet everything seems to remain the same. No clear answers, no visible direction, no sign from heaven, just silence. And that's exactly where many give up. Because we've been taught that if we do everything right, God will answer quickly. That true faith brings immediate results. That prayer well said brings blessings without delay. But that's not what Jesus promised. What he promised was, "I will be with you always." And sometimes being with us doesn't mean answering right away. It means silently supporting us. This silence can confuse, it can hurt, it can make you doubt yourself. Is my faith weak? Is God ignoring me? Have I done something wrong? But pay attention, God's silence, it is not absence, it is preparation, it is process, it is protection. God is not silent because he has moved away. He is silent because he is doing something that, for now, you would not understand. He is building within you something greater than your question, something that can only be born in silence. In the Bible, we see countless examples of this. One of the most striking is that of Job. He was an upright, faithful, God-fearing man, and suddenly he lost everything: his family, his health, his possessions, and most distressingly, he also lost the perception of God's presence. Job prayed, cried out, asked, begged for answers, and nothing. The sky seemed like bronze, and yet he remained, even without understanding, even without hearing, even without seeing. And it was in this silence that Job was refined, his faith was purified, his vision of God was transformed. God's silence does not mean rejection. Often it means maturity. Because God does not respond to satisfy our anxiety, He responds to fulfill a purpose. And when that purpose requires inner growth, He takes us into the wilderness. And in the wilderness, everything seems quiet. But it is in that quiet that we are shaped. Maybe you're walking through this wilderness right now, praying with an open heart, seeking earnestly, trying to stand firm, but all is still silent. And I want you to know, God sees, God hears, God feels. And He is much closer than you think. Silence is not neglect, it is part of the answer. There are times when God is silent so that you can learn to trust Him, not His answers. Because the faith that survives silence is the faith that is ready to experience the fulfillment of the promise. And sometimes God is using this silence to protect you from yourself, from hasty decisions, from wrong paths, from relationships that would not do you good. He is holding back the answer because if it came now, it might take you away from your purpose and not bring you closer to Him. And the most beautiful thing about all this is that even in silence, God continues to act. He is working between the lines, touching hearts, moving invisible pieces, sending people, adjusting situations, preparing places, and most importantly, preparing you. Because when the answer comes, and it will, you will be ready to live it with maturity, balance, and gratitude. In the meantime, your part is to remain. It is not to understand everything. It is not to force an answer. It is to trust. It is to keep praying even without hearing. It is to keep believing even without seeing. It is to keep walking even when the path seems invisible. This is faith, and the faith that crosses the silence is the faith that enters into the promise. Jesus also experienced the silence of the Father. In the Garden of Gethsemane, He prayed intensely, asking that, if possible, the cup be taken away. But heaven was silent, not because the Father had abandoned Him, but because the plan needed to be fulfilled. And in that silence, Jesus chose to obey. He chose to trust. Not my will, but yours be done. And it was through that silence that the greatest answer in history came, the salvation of humanity. What does this teach us? That God's answer doesn't always come in words. Sometimes it comes in the form of strength to endure, wisdom to wait, faith to continue. Sometimes silence itself is the answer. Because it is in silence that you learn that God is not a heavenly attendant, ready to carry out your commands. He is a Father. He knows what He is doing. And even without saying anything, He is taking care of you. So if you are in a time of silence, don't despair. Don't think that your prayers are being ignored. Keep going to God, even if it's in silence. Keep pouring yourself out. Keep trusting. Because this silence carries more answers than you can imagine. And when the time for the answer comes, because it will come, you will look back and understand that the silence was not absence. It was grace. It was love. It was a care that only today can you recognize. And you will realize that even when silent, God never stopped being God. He never stopped being Father. He never stopped being with you. Let's now dive into one of the most transformative aspects of prayer, when it stops being about what we want and starts being about what God wants. You'll find that the most powerful prayers are those that align with heaven, not those that try to manipulate heaven. And that can completely change the way you pray starting today. If you've come this far, it's because you've already understood that prayer goes far beyond words. It's about surrender. It's about relationship. It's about permanence, even when heaven seems silent. But now it's time to take another step, perhaps the most challenging of all, aligning your will with God's will. This is where many get stuck, because deep down, we all have a list of things we want to see happen. Dreams, plans, relationships, healings, achievements. And there is nothing wrong with asking. Jesus himself taught us to present our needs before the Father. But there is a crucial difference between asking and demanding, between desiring and determining. And that difference is called surrender. Jesus taught us to pray like this: "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." And this is not just a pretty phrase or a spiritual formality. It is the heart of mature prayer. It is the posture of someone who has understood that God knows more, sees more, and loves more than we do. It is the place where prayer stops being an attempt to convince God to do what we want and becomes a space to discover what He wants to do in us. Praying for God's will is risky for the ego, but liberating for the soul, because it means letting go of control. It means admitting that while we have legitimate desires, we trust that His plan is best, even when it doesn't make sense, even when it hurts, even when it feels like He's denying us something. In truth, God never denies us anything without having something greater in mind and something more aligned with our eternal purpose. One of the greatest examples of this is Jesus in Gethsemane. Faced with imminent pain and the weight of the cross, he prays, "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." But then he immediately declares, "Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." This is the most powerful prayer in the Bible, because in it, Jesus gives up his human will to submit completely to the divine plan. And it is this surrender that saved us. It was this prayer that moved heaven, not because it changed the circumstances, but because it revealed a heart that was completely surrendered. How many times have you prayed for something with all the strength of your faith, and yet the answer was no, or not yet? And how did you react? Did you get frustrated? Did you walk away? Did you question God's love? It's in these moments that alignment is tested. It's then that you discover whether you're seeking God's will or just waiting for Him to confirm yours. When we learn to pray based on His will, our lives change, because we stopped praying with anxiety and started praying with confidence. We stop treating God as someone who needs to be convinced and start treating Him as someone who wants the best for us. Our prayer becomes less about results and more about transformation. And in the process, we realize that the real answer isn't always what we ask for, but who we become while we wait. This doesn't mean you shouldn't ask in faith. Quite the contrary. Pray boldly. Present your dreams. Talk about your projects, but always be willing to hear yes, no, or wait. And in each of these answers, trust that God is guiding your story perfectly. The prayer that moves heaven is not the one that shouts the loudest, but the one that aligns with the Father's heart. When you truly say, "Lord, let your will be done," you are saying, "I trust you more than I trust my own desires." And that is spiritual maturity. That is faith in its purest form. There is a powerful peace that comes when you let go of control. When instead of trying to convince God to do what you want, you start asking, "What do you want to teach me by this? What do you want to transform in me? What part of your will am I still resisting?" And little by little, you will realize that many of the things you were asking for, in fact, would not bring you closer to God. And that others which you avoided or feared were exactly what He would use to strengthen you. The Apostle Paul also experienced this. In 2 Corinthians, he says that he prayed 3 times, asking God to remove a thorn in his flesh, something that was deeply bothering him. And what was God's answer? "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." God did not remove the thorn, but He gave Paul the strength to endure. And Paul, instead of complaining, began to glorify what had previously made him suffer, because he understood that by aligning his will with God's, he became stronger, more dependent, more useful. And that is the invitation for you today. Pray for your dreams, your requests, your struggles, but also pray saying, "Father, above all, may your will be done." Because it is in this surrender that true transformation happens, and it is in this attitude that you experience the depth of prayer that Jesus taught us, not a prayer that changes the heavens by force, but one that shapes the earth with grace. Let's make everything even more practical. You'll learn how to apply everything you've learned so far to your daily life. We'll give you simple, accessible steps to help you start praying as Jesus taught right now. Because knowing is important, but living is what changes everything. Now that we've come this far, it's time to recap what really matters. You've come to understand that prayer is not a formula, it's not a performance, it's not an empty ritual. It's a relationship, it's truth, it's life. You've learned that Jesus condemned mechanical prayers made to impress others and showed us a model that begins with intimacy and ends with surrender. The Lord's Prayer is not a text to repeat, it's a map for living. It's through it that we discover how to worship, trust, ask, forgive, resist, and surrender completely to God's will. You also heard the story of Samuel, a man who lost everything and found himself again through true prayer, a prayer without masks, without rehearsal, without pretense. It was in this place of brokenness that God began to restore his life. And perhaps you find yourself in that same place now, tired, trying, searching. Perhaps you have understood that what you lacked was not more words, but more truth, not more formulas, but more presence. We also talked about God's silence. That sacred space where it seems like nothing is happening, but in fact everything is being prepared, because silence is also an answer. And most of all, you learned that the most powerful prayers are not those that shout to heaven, but those that align with God's will. It is when you pray, "Thy will be done," that heaven moves with greater intensity, not to please you, but to transform you. Now the question remains, what are you going to do with all this? The right answer is not to save this content, but live this content. And for that, you need to start, not tomorrow, not next week, now. From the moment this video ends, you can take the first step. Find a quiet place, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and pray. But pray with your heart. Pray as if God were in front of you, because He is. Pray without fear, without rushing, without formula. Speak like a child who loves, trusts, and depends. And then listen, wait, be silent, and perceive what the Spirit wants to reveal to you. If you wish, use the structure of the Lord's Prayer as a basis. Begin by acknowledging God as your Father. Praise His name. Surrender your will. Ask for what you need today. Release forgiveness. Ask for strength. Surrender. But do this consciously. Live each word. And most importantly, make this a habit again. Not a burden, but a pleasure. Because the more you pray this way, the more your heart is molded to what heaven wants to do in you. Now, if all this has touched your heart deeply, then prove that you are different, that you are not just another person who listens and forgets, that you are among those who choose to live in a transformative way. So comment below with complete conviction, "I am aligned with God's will." We at the channel will leave a like on your comment as a sign of recognition and support for your decision. And yes, we will follow your growth, because those who take a stand with faith deserve to be followed closely. Oh, and don't forget, subscribe to the channel right now. Activate the bell so you don't miss any content like this, which will nourish, strengthen, and guide you at every stage of your spiritual journey. This journey is just beginning, and you will want to be with us until the end. And before we leave, there's one more thing. What was the code that turned the key inside you? Comment below. We want to know which part spoke to your heart the most. Your experience can inspire other lives. And if this video reached you, share with as many people as possible. Be generous. Just as you were blessed with this content, bless other lives too. Take this message forward, be an instrument, and now look at the 2 videos that are being suggested to you on the screen. Each of them was specially chosen to help you continue this process of transformation. One will take you even deeper into your life of prayer. The other will teach you how to keep your faith firm, even in the greatest storms. Watch both. Don't skip. Don't put it off. Because the next step in your change could be in one of these videos. And believe me, this could be the moment you've been praying for.